I'm a private investigator in a small town. In case you didn't know, the woods around here are very creepy. In 2016, despite how cliché it sounds, I was working as a private investigator in rural Oregon. Most people make the stereotype that private detectives and investigators have walk-in clients, but that simply isn't true. I get almost all of my cases from clients by phone, and the call I got in June was no exception. The client, a man named Jonathan Alexander, was calling about the disappearance of his father, Sergio Alexander. Jonathan's father had gone missing ever since a solo deer hunting trip in the backwoods of our little Oregon town, and the search parties and official parties hadn't turned up anything. In most cases like this, you're looking for a body in the woods, not a live person. But Jonathan was hopeful, so I gave him the benefit of the doubt. In this case, I took my go bag. A duffel bag, and its contents were a bottle of water, a first aid kit, my Taurus Raging Hunter, a bag of Ziploc bags, my wallet and phone and food. A Taurus Raging Hunter revolver might have been overkill, but I was planning to go into the woods. And the woods can be a dangerous place. This part of Oregon was stocked full of cougars, mountain lions, bears, wolves, moose, and some others, and almost everyone carried a heavier firearm when going into the backwoods. The first place on my schedule was Jonathan's house, where I would meet him in person and have an interview. As I pulled up into his dirt driveway, I got a sense of the kind of person he was. His house was a 25-foot trailer stuck to the ground with a backyard and patio facing the mountains. "Are you Jonathan?" I asked the man waiting for me. He was tall, at least 6'5", and wearing a checkered button-up, a trucker cap, and jeans. "Yeah," he replied. "You're Inspector Jacob, right? Come inside, I'll tell you the details. I also have some things that could help you, depending on how willing you are." I walked inside the trailer, and the interior was everything I expected. The walls were lined with taxidermied base and catfish, as well as several mounted deer heads and rifles propped up on display. A dirty kitchen with piles of dishes was one corner, and a small two-person dinner table. John for short, and I sat down. Jonathan offered me a beer, but I declined. I never drank on a job. I started with the regular questions. Where was he last seen? Who was with him? What happened leading up to the night of the disappearance? John replied, telling the whole story. My dad, Sergio, was a hunter and fisherman. Hunting and fishing were his life. He always had a rifle or a fishing rod. He's in his 60s and was in the military for 7 years, had a few tours in Afghanistan. On that night, he wanted to go solo buck hunting in the evening. So I dropped him off on a dirt road near his favorite spot. He didn't come back for 2 days. This was somewhat normal. He sometimes hunted overnight or just got lost. After a week passed, I got really worried. I could feel that something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut. I called the sheriff, and they organized a search party for 3 nights. We went in every direction, covered all the ground, and you know what? Not a single thing. Not a candy bar, no footsteps leading past his spot, no trail, nothing. After he was declared deceased, I went out myself to search. I know he's still out there, I know it. And where is this dirt road? John marked the road on the GPS on my phone, and I thanked him and left. I had a no-solve, no-pay rule, so I wouldn't get paid unless I actually found Sergio, dead or alive. My next stop was at the sheriff's office, in the middle of my small town. I drove past multiple roadside stores until I reached the parking lot of the sheriff's office. I parked and walked into the place, going up to the front desk where a tall and skinny deputy was doing paperwork and chewing gum, presumably as a substitute for cigarettes. I told him that I was looking into the disappearance of Sergio Alexander, and he sent me to the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a balding man in his 50s named Clyde, showed a forced smile as I walked inside. A stained American flag was pinned to the wall, along with dozens of missing person posters and wanted posters. "So, Inspector, is this missing guy a friend of yours?" he asked. "No," I replied. "A client wants me to find him. Sergio is the guy's dad." "Well, you're in luck," Clyde replied. "We haven't gotten much criminal activity, so I can show you some of the search party reports." Clyde reached into his desk and pulled out a stack of papers and photos, which I flicked through. One of the photos captured an image showing a trail of footprints ending abruptly. "And what is this?" I asked. "It's the strangest part of the case. The footprints leading to Sergio's favorite hunting spot just stopped. No trail leading somewhere else, no tire tracks, no ATV tracks, nothing. It's like he just up and vanished into thin air." I sighed. This case was going to be a hard one. What else of interest was there, I asked, looking through the files. Clyde pulled out a satellite image of the woods with a Sharpie written on the spot where Sergio had gone missing. This is the entire area in which we estimate that Sergio could have walked around in the time he was gone, Clyde stated. We checked every bit of it, and guess what? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. But there was one thing we found of interest. Which is, I asked. There was a pattern. Every time we checked a place, we heard Sergio's radio coming from somewhere. I raised an eyebrow. Sheriff Clyde continued, but it was very, very faint. Could barely hear it. And another strange thing was when we went to search for Sergio in the entire area where he went missing, all the birds and animals were quiet, even the crickets. As soon as we left the area of the supposed disappearance, the sound all came back. I checked the watch. It was early evening. After jotting down all the notes I could gather, I thanked the sheriff and left. My next stop. The woods. By the time I pulled up to the dirt road in my pickup truck, it was well into getting dark. This wasn't the ideal time for me to search through the area and find clues. Every detective knows how important the first 45 hours are. The place was exactly as John had described it. It was extremely rural, just a few miles away from a mountain range, and it was completely silent. The forest should have been alive, with birds chirping, wild turkeys moving about, crickets chirping, but the night was dead. Turning on my headlamp, I found Sergio's footsteps from when he was last seen and started combing through the area. Just like Clyde and Jonathan had said, the trail abruptly stopped in the middle of the woods. Nothing. No other signs that Sergio was even there. It was as if he had just up and vanished. Suddenly I heard some rustling behind me. It was fully dark by now and nobody should have been there besides me. The sound came again, except it was now in front of me, but just out of the reach of my headlamp. "Who's there?" I yelled. "Show yourself. I'm armed." For dramatization, I flicked the revolver holster from my Taurus on my belt. Suddenly something tapped me right on the back. I didn't have time to pull out my gun, and considering that whoever was doing this was probably some drunk guy, I wouldn't need it. I turned and threw a Mike Tyson haymaker in the thing's direction and ended up hitting a tree and nearly breaking my wrist. In the split second that I was proud of my Mike Tyson haymaker, I realized that I had punched a tree and that my knuckles were actually bleeding. Whoever was behind me, if there was someone behind me, they were long gone. And that was when the laughing started. Actually, it was more like cackling. Weird, crazy, and unnatural cackling. Whatever you'd call it, it was unsettling anyway. I pulled out my revolver designed to drop bears and fired a deafening shot into the air. The laughing, everything, stopped for a bit, and I almost put my guard down. Then I heard something whisper just an inch away from my ear. It said, leave this place. And the next thing I know, I hear the sound of a million running footsteps catching up to me, and I GTFO. I ran right out of the woods, fast enough to outrun Usain Bolt. Adrenaline is one heck of a drug. I jumped in my pickup truck, turned the engine, and peeled out of there, all in record time. Whatever was behind me was still chasing me behind the car. I looked into the rearview mirror to try to look at the thing, which was running at least 80 miles per hour to keep up with me, and I saw nothing. Well, it wasn't a conceptual nothing. It was nothing in the sense that it was nothing my brain could comprehend and understand. There was a huge blurry shape running after me, dark as the night and fuzzy around the edges. It was as if somebody took a huge mass of static from an 80s TV, made it into some sort of creature, and put it on a dirt road at 9 o'clock to chase some poor private investigator. I turned the road and drove down the road until I reached the town. The thing was obviously gone. I parked at a gas station parking lot and threw up once my body realized how much running I had done. The next day I headed to a woman named Meredith's house. I had heard about her from when I was at the bar the night I saw the demon thing by some paranormal junkies who were particularly interested in what I said. Meredith apparently owned a tea and plant shop at the edge of town, having the shop based on the first floor of her house. She also knew a thing or two about paranormal entities, the occult, monsters, ghouls, and, well, you get the gist. I pulled up into the driveway of her shop and knocked on the door. "We're closed, asshole," somebody, probably Meredith, yelled. I looked at the store hours taped on the front door. Today was a Friday, and according to her probably outdated store hours chart, she was, as a matter of fact, open. "You're open, so stop being lazy," I yelled right back. Meredith groaned and opened the triple-locked door. In person, she was a short Latino woman with long black hair and a purple beanie and wearing a trench coat and jeans, which was totally not suspicious. "What do you want?" she snapped. "What I want is to know what is in those woods. And lady, don't piss me off, I'm still on a hangover. You study the paranormal and supernatural, or am I wrong?" "No, you're not wrong." "Good. Because yesterday I got bullied and chased by some weird demon thing while looking for a missing man in his 60s. Meredith's face went pale. I taught myself how to learn and read expressions people make, and by the looks of it, she knew exactly what I was talking about. "Come in, I might be able to help you." Like Jonathan's house, I was easily able to tell the interior of the house from the inside. There were plants everywhere on the walls, growing in giant pots on the floor, as well as shelves stocked full of beakers and test tubes, and a few bags full of strange substances. I sat down on a worn-out couch while Meredith assessed my situation. "First of all, who told you about me?" she asked. "Some British fellow named Ron," I said. But then again, I was drunk, so he might have been a John or Bob. "How did you say this thing looked like?" "Big, dark, blurry. I couldn't actually see it since it was at least 100 feet away, but it was running 80 miles per hour, whatever it was. Huge, must have been over 20 feet big." "Did you look at it directly?" Meredith asked. I answered plainly. "No, I looked at it through the rearview mirror, and even then I couldn't see it well." "Must be why you're alive." "What was that?" I asked. "What you just described is what we in the business call nagalakwis." "Nagalakwis," I muttered. "The heck is that?" "No one really knows," Meredith replied. "He, she, whatever Nagalaku is ancient, has been in these woods for probably over a century, and no one knows where he came from. You said that you were looking for a missing guy, right? Well, Nagalaku probably took him. Nagalaku might eat him, might let him, might eat him, might him go, might keep him for eternity, I don't know." "Then how do I kill this thing?" I asked. "I need to close this case." "You probably can't," Meredith said. "But whatever you do, don't look directly at Nagalaku, or your mind will literally melt at the unfathomable horror, and you will die. Do not look at it." "Don't look at the demon thing," I said. "Gotcha. Do you have, any herbs or materials that will stop Nagalaku from hurting me or doing anything?" "Yes, actually I do. It's white ash blessed by a shaman. If you sprinkle it over yourself or any weapons you have, it should be more effective against any supernatural being." Meredith stood up, walked towards a cabinet, and pulled out a large Ziploc bag of white ash, which seemed to glow and vibrate, and she handed it to me. "This ain't free," she said. "It's $100. I sighed, reached into my wallet, pulled out $100 in cash, and handed it to Meredith in exchange for the white ash. "Hey," Meredith called out as I packed up my stuff and headed for the door. "Yeah." "Be careful." Like that was even possible. I got out of there and drove to the gas station, where I planned to get my supplies to hunt Nagalakwa and find Sergio Alexander, but before that I needed to fuel up. I bought incendiary rounds for my revolver that the gas station surprisingly sold, and I ordered pineapple pizza while listening to Piano Man by Billy Joel. After I finished up and threw out my garbage, I devised a plan which involved flares, a bottle of vodka, a huge jug filled with gasoline, and a Molotov cocktail. The cashier, a guy named John, seemed very interested in the thing I bought from the gas station. He was a tall guy in his 50s, with a graying beard, a trucker cap, and a military attitude. "What are all these things for?" he asked, as I heaved the heavy gasoline tank onto the counter along with some other flammable and extremely dangerous things. "Oh, nothing," I answered, trying not to sound suspicious, just trying to take care of a pest problem. But John didn't see that as anything. "You're going into the woods, ain't ya?" I was caught off guard at how easily and accurately he knew what I was doing. "Yes," I replied. "Well, I'm off work after this shift, so I'll come with you. Or I could just report to the police that a private investigator is buying suspicious amounts of flammables and gasoline, along with 45 Magnum incendiary rounds for a Taurus Raging Hunter revolver." "You Army?" I asked. "Not exactly," he replied. "Been in the US Marines for a couple of years, had 5 tours in Afghanistan." I didn't see any reason why John shouldn't come with me, and besides I could use his military and combat skills, which might be useful, and I wasn't going to carry a 55-gallon tank full of gasoline in the middle of the woods alone. Fine, I said, let's do this. A few hours later, just as the sun was setting, John and I got out of my pickup truck in front of the woods. John had brought his trusty 12-gauge, packed with dragon's breath incendiary rounds and a mini flamethrower. John would be my backup and the bait while I carried the gasoline tank duct taped to an explosive Molotov cocktail. The plan was that we would go to the woods, to the spot where I had last been attacked by Sagoth, and wait. Once we heard a sign of him, we would both put on our blindfolds to avoid having our souls sucked out by the unfathomable sight of the eldritch cosmic horror. Ready? John asked. Yeah, I said. Just don't shoot me while you have your blindfold on. We walked into the woods in silence, and after a mile or so I reached the spot where Sergio was last seen. We sat there and waited an hour or so until all the noise suddenly stopped, and I heard the sound of something massive dragging across the forest floor. Put on your blindfold, I said, putting on mine. We can't risk seeing this thing. John nodded, grinned, and put the blindfold on. Whatever it was sounded massive. It said in a demonic and ancient voice, "Leave this place." John and I fired a shot in the direction of the voice, and although my bullet missed by a mile, the old man's shot was a direct hit. Although I couldn't hear it, I saw the light from the blast of fire, sparks, and flames coming from the barrel of John's shotgun, and it hit the demon monster. The thing screeched, and we moved back a few steps, still blind. And without warning, the ground opened beneath us. What the fuck? John and I fell into the cavern beneath us, 6 feet. You okay? I asked. Never been better, John replied. What is this place? I lifted my blindfold and looked around to see that we had fallen into a subterranean tunnel that led deeper into the earth. Anyone there? Fucking hell, a voice screamed, presumably Sergio's based on the circumstances. We ran down the tunnel and searched for Sergio, and we found the man lying on the cave floor with a broken leg. We're gonna get you out, Tahir, I said. I heard a screech come from the entrance to the tunnel as Nagalaku crawled down, breaking the walls. I reached down and picked up the tank of gasoline, had my eyes closed, and waited until Nagalaku was just close enough, my heart beating. Get out. Ka. I lit the Molotov and yelled at John to take cover, just as Nagalaku got within a dozen meters of our range. I had previously sprinkled the white ash Meredith had given me on the gasoline tank for extra effectiveness, and so that could kill Nagalaku if the explosion didn't. Nagalaku was only a few meters away from us. I lit the gasoline bomb and threw it, and as it exploded I grinned. Gotcha, asshole. So the funny thing is, a group of redneck hunters found us later. They had apparently found the hole and the explosion crater and investigated. John and I had suffered some mild burns from the enormous gasoline explosion, but the missing guy, Sergio, came out harmless besides the broken leg he already had. The redneck family dragged us all the way to their pickup truck, then drove us to the hospital, where we both got treated for our injuries. Sergio was found and reunited after a long disappearance, and Jonathan paid me in the thousands with the money I didn't expect him to have. When I went back to the place where Sergio had disappeared and where I had blown Nagalaku high to the sky, I found a very strange, giant, half-human skeleton where I remembered Nagalaku getting blown up. Sergio Alexander was found, and I had killed one of the things that went bump in the night. Case closed. Don't play with the woods, kids. I'm a private investigator, and I'm afraid this case may be my last. I have no family left now that my ex and my son have cut me out of their lives, so here I am sharing what will likely be my last words with strangers. Please excuse any typos. I've never been good with words, and I know it's only a matter of time before I'll be unable to write anything ever again. Marla and Nathan, if you're reading this, I'm sorry for all the pain I've caused. I should have paid more attention to the red flags. Maybe if I had, I wouldn't be holed up in a dark closet in someone's basement surrounded by a puddle of my own blood. He had looked so nervous when he showed up unannounced, introducing himself as Dave. He'd studied my house as we walked through to my office, as if trying to memorize each detail. What struck me about him, besides the odd smell that clung to his clothes, was how timid and soft-spoken he was. I had to coax him into actually taking a seat and making eye contact with me. Once he did, though, his stare was unnervingly intense, almost predatory. "I need you to watch my wife." I nodded. It was a fairly common request, finding out where the spouse, fiancé, or significant other was going during the day, what they were doing, and oftentimes who. It isn't the most exciting type of job, but it typically pays fairly well and usually ends up being safer than many I've taken over the years. After the recent accident and with the new metal rod in my leg, I was all for something low-key. I laid out the terms of my employment, how much I charge an hour, all of that, as he nodded along, never once breaking eye contact. "What's your wife's name?" He stood up so abruptly that he knocked his chair over and leered at me, eyes narrowed. I tensed, putting my hands up placatingly. I thought he might come over the desk. He shuddered as if trying to shake himself out of it, and then sat back down. "Sorry," he laughed nervously. Of course you wouldn't know that." We sat in silence for a moment. I considered sending him away, but I needed the money and he'd offered to pay the full amount up front in cash. The downside of the work that I do is that I tend to meet people who, while at their worst, are desperate, afraid, and frustrated. I made a mental note to try and rent out my old space from before the accident, so at the very least I wouldn't be having these types of meetings in my home. "Where do you think she's going?" "I need you to watch her sleep." Now that gave me pause. Of everything I'd ever been asked to do, something about that made me more anxious. It was her request, he added, perhaps in response to the concern written on my face. "And why does she need someone to watch her sleep?" He smiled at me for the first time, a bit too widely. "You'll see." I figured that at least she'd been the one to request that I be there, which, while still strange, felt less intrusive. At the time I wasn't sure why he hired me to watch a sleeping woman at $100 an hour. When that night came, as I sat in my car, I felt my anxiety spike. I'd never done a job like this before in my life, and while strange, it seemed too good to be true. No crouching in bushes, sitting in a hot car for hours on end, but in the back of my mind I couldn't shake the image, the momentary crack in Dave's calm persona, the absolute abhorrence with which he looked at me. It all felt wrong. I told myself it was fine, I was just on edge after the accident, and did my usual pre-driving ritual. Deep breath in. Deep breath out. Wait, start the car. Their house looked like your run-of-the-mill colonial from the outside, well-manicured lawn, cheery flowers, baby blue siding, and a porch swing. The inside was a different story entirely. When Dave opened the door, cobwebs floated through the air from where they'd been disturbed, drifting through the pale moonlight. Dust coated nearly every surface I could see. I clutched my light coat to my body to keep from shivering after I stepped inside. It was a good 30 degrees colder than I kept in my own house. The lights were dim, just barely bright enough for me to see where I was going. It wasn't the dust or the dark or the cold that fazed me, though. It was the smell. From the moment I stepped over the threshold, it hit me. Faint, but immensely unpleasant, like meat gone bad. Christy is upstairs. The only parts of the house I'd seen so far that weren't in total disarray were the pictures plastered along the entry hall. They were all of Dave, with a striking blonde woman, his wife Christy, I guessed. He looked so happy in them, a stark contrast to the waxen and grim-faced man I'd come to know. As I kept walking, I passed an end table with pictures of just her. Little trinkets were laid out, a woman's engagement ring, and a lock of hair. I realized what I was looking at. It was a shrine. My heart pounded at the thought of what I was possibly walking into. As we approached the dark stairwell, the smell intensified. I still don't know what possessed me to stay. Dave started up the stairs, and after a moment, I followed slowly, clutching the banister and making my way up the best I could. "Bad leg." I nodded. By the time we reached the top, the smell of decay and rot had become so strong that it made my eyes water. As he slowly opened the door to the bedroom, I held my breath, both to keep the fetid air from my lungs and also out of anticipation of what I was about to see. On the bed, bundled up under blankets, was the woman from the pictures, Christy. To my immense relief, she was alive, albeit asleep. There was a single chair facing the bed, which Dave gestured to. "Can I get you something to drink?" he asked as I plopped down none too gracefully. I nodded appreciatively, staring at Christy, still unsure of what was happening and what exactly I was supposed to do. I was surprised when he came back with an entire bottle of whiskey. I asked if I could take him up on some water instead, and he looked me up and down before walking away again without a word. As I stared at the small figure in the bed, pale and delicate looking, with blonde hair around her like a halo, I realized she looked so familiar I wondered where I'd seen her before. I only had a moment to ponder that before the bottle struck me in the head. The last thing I remember was the sting as alcohol seeped into the wound, doubling the searing pain. When I awoke, I was in a partially finished basement. I felt the cold cement on my cheek as I opened my eyes to see that Dave was inches from my face, smiling at me. I sat up, woozy. I was near a drain that was flecked with bits of soggy tissue and clumps of hair, and the rancid smell that arose from it hit me in a wave. Blood had stained the concrete. There was far too much of it to just be my own. I managed to prop myself up and then fought the urge to vomit when I saw that a tuft of black hair still attached to the scalp had been pinned under my arm and was stuck to my bare flesh. "I'm calling the police," I whispered, the empty threat hoarsely. I doubted I could fish the phone out of my pocket faster than he could do whatever he had planned for me. I highly suspected that he'd just tossed me down both flights of stairs. My entire body was throbbing with a dull pain that battled the jagged cuts along my head for my attention. Sure, his laugh unsettled me. "Please do that. Please tell them how an unlicensed PI is at my home at 3 a.m. reeking of alcohol. Tell them how you're here to kill my wife a second time." Jesus. I suddenly realized why Christy looked so familiar. It was only for a moment, but it's still imprinted on my mind no matter how hard I try to erase it. I shouldn't have been behind the wheel. A part of me knew I wasn't up to driving. I could have called a cab or an Uber, but I didn't. Her mouth had formed a perfect O, blue eyes wide. Of course she was surprised. She'd been driving on the correct side of the road. She wouldn't have expected to suddenly see headlights pointed at her as I barreled down the small highway going 75. Her reflexes were fast, but in her panic, she'd swerved too hard in the opposite direction, and I'd heard the sound of screeching metal and shattering glass as her car wrapped around a tree. I made it out without so much as a scratch. It was almost as if I'd never been there at all. It was a miracle she'd survived. But no, she hadn't, I reminded myself. I'd have stuck around if there was any chance she had still been alive. It was too late. I could tell by looking at her car that there was nothing I could do for her. The news later confirmed my suspicions. Died on the scene. I had a wife, a son, a job, and my entire life ahead of me. Later, the guilt and self-loathing would end those relationships anyway, but at the time, all I could think of was what I stood to lose if I got caught. "How is she?" "Still here," I whispered. "Oh, now you remember her." He flashed a bitter smile at me. "She was my world, Michael. I couldn't live without her. I found a way where I wouldn't have to." I managed to stand, but found myself backed against a wall. Remaining upright was a struggle. Dave continued towards me, unsteady, unhinged. "There's no way to really, truly bring someone back. Not completely. No matter what you offer in exchange, she's not the same. I wanted to go after you as soon as I found you, but Christy, there used to still be a bit of Christy in there. She convinced me not to. But you did it again." He pointed his head accusingly towards my leg. "No one else got hurt this time," I gasped. "Never again." "I'm sorry, Michael. We just don't believe you." The floorboards above my head creaked. Something heavy was moving across the floor. "She's so hungry. It's been difficult, but when you love someone, you make sacrifices for them." I heard her footsteps as she descended the basement stairs, slow, deliberate. I looked around frantically. He was between me and the only exit, and the windows were far too tiny for me to fit through. The only place I could hide was in a tiny closet on the finished side. I slid along the wall in that direction as he followed. I've seen it a few times by now. It won't be fast. It will take days of digestion before you're truly dead, but even that is still far faster than you deserve. She leaned forward and peeked her head down at me, grinning, her blonde hair a curtain through which her eyes glinted in the scant light. She moved unnaturally, and even in the shadows I could see that her skin seemed to be shifting, like whatever was in there was aching to come out. Dave was transfixed as she strode towards us. The look he gave her as she approached was one of sheer adoration. even as what should have been flesh and bone began unfurling to reveal a gaping maw. As she came close enough that I could see the hundreds of teeth ringing the now fully open mouth, I swung at Dave blindly. I seemed to have caught them both by surprise, allowing me to narrowly avoid being pulled into the living darkness that had once been Christy. Instead, she only caught the lower half of my bad leg. The distinct feeling of flesh and bone dissolving away hit me instantaneously. She began to drag me backward. I frantically clawed against the rough concrete floor, trying to pull myself towards the tiny closet nails shredded, fingertips bloody, when I heard a meaty-sounding rip, and the resistance was finally gone. I tried to ignore the sound of the exposed bone and metal dragging on cement and tried to stay conscious despite the pain. I managed it just long enough to reach the small dark space and lock the door from the inside. That was hours ago. I don't know what to do. I can't run, but even if I could, there's no way I could get past them. I hear them on the other side. Every so often Dave will whisper to her softly. I have no doubt that a flimsy door and a small piece of metal will be no problem for something like her, whatever she is. The bits and pieces I've found of others unfortunate enough to have met their end in this same closet confirm that to me. I don't know when she will decide to come for the rest of me. All I can think about is how any moment now could be my last. I cannot stop vividly picturing what my death will be like at her hands. This is not a plea for forgiveness. I do not deserve it. I just need to tell someone what happened to me. I need someone to know what I did. I have a feeling that soon this and a few pieces of indigestible hair, bone, and a metal rod will be all that remains of me.